So yeah, story-wise, today the elves tried to recover the compromised servers. McSkiddy's SOC team have identified abnormal activity and noticed that a massive amount of data is being sent to an unknown server. This was identified on day 9. An insider has likely created a malicious backdoor, and McSkiddy has contacted Detective Frosteel from law enforcement to help them. Can you assist Detective Frosteel in taking down the command and control server? We're going to understand what server-side request forgery is, the different types of server-side request forgery and how they're used to exploit the vulnerability. We're going to have a prerequisite for exploiting the vulnerability, how the attack works, how to exploit the vulnerability, and the mitigation measures. So what is SSRF? So server-side request forgery is a security vulnerability that occurs when the attacker tricks a web application into making an unauthorized request to an internal or external resource on the server's behalf. This allows attackers to interact with internal systems, potentially leading to data exposure or unauthorized actions. Leaving web applications vulnerable to SSRF can have a profound security implication, potentially leading to unauthorized access to internal systems, remote code execution, data breaches, or the application being further compromised. So the basic types, we have basic, which is the basic SSRF attack. The attacker sends a crafted request to a vulnerable server to an internal or an external resource. For example, they might attempt to access a file on the local file system, any internal services, or the databases that are not intended to be publicly accessible. And then we've got blind SSRF. So in this type of attack, the attacker doesn't directly see the response to that request. Instead, they may infer from the information they get about the internal network by measuring the time that it takes for that server to respond or observing error message changes. And then a semi-blind, the attacker doesn't receive a direct response again. However, they can then rely on indirect clues such as side channel information or observable effects within the application to determine the success or failure of their SSRF request. This might involve monitoring changes in the application behavior, response times, error messages, and other signs. So the prerequisite. So we have a vulnerable input. The web application must have an input field that is susceptible to manipulation. It can be a URL or a file upload. And then a lack of input validation. So the application should have adequate input validation or an effective sanitization mechanism. And then if you don't, you're allowing the attacker to craft a malicious request. So how does SSRF work? By identifying a vulnerable input, the attacker, once they've located that field, within the application, it can be manipulated to trigger the server-side requests. This can be in a URL parameter in a web form, an API endpoint, a request parameter, or the request parameter input, such as referrer. Then they manipulate the input, so the attacker inputs a malicious URL or other payload that causes the application to make an unintended request. This input can be a URL pointing to an internal server, a loopback address, or an external server under the attacker's control. Then they request the unauthorized resource, so the application server, unaware of the malicious input, makes the request as the URL that was specified for the resource, and then this request is then it could target internal resources, sensitive services, or external systems. And finally, the exploitation of the response. So depending on the application behavior, the attacker payload, the response from the malicious request may provide valuable information, such as internal server data, credentials, system credentials, or a pathway to further exploitation. So using SSRF to hack the command and control server. Disclaimer, hacking a command and control is ethically unacceptable and illegal. Any suspected C2 activity should be reported to the appropriate incident response team for investigation and mitigation. This knowledge is provided solely for educational purposes. So yeah, don't hack back. It's generally not a good idea. Detective Frosteel is checking for C2 against known vulnerabilities. None have worked, and he's decided to give SSRF a shot. Now that we know how SSRF works, can you help Detective Frosteel take down the C2 server? We do need an attack box today, or I'm going to use my VM. We have started the target VM, that's already running, as you can see, and then we've launched it. We need to, this time we actually have to add a C2 server, and we have to add the host name to the box. So we need to copy the domain. make sure it's not in the way. Cool. So yeah, so we need to sudo nano etc hosts, and we're going to put in a new .10.24.16. Cool. So that means when we visit this IP now, it's going to go and like pretend that it's actually got a valid DNS. So we're going to identify the vulnerable input. We should probably check that my link is working. Which probably isn't. Right. Save the file. That should be working. Why are you not? Domain in. There we go. So maybe it didn't like Googling it. Right, cool. So we can move on. So we have to identify the vulnerable input. Once we visit the URL for the command and control server, we'll see that it's protected by a login panel. McSkilly's pen tester team have launched different types of automated and manual scans to gain access, all in vain. For the target to be exploitable for SSRF, we need to use a vulnerable input to force the request to the server. Sometimes the request can be found through scanning, viewing source code, or other documentation logs. So we're going to manipulate the input. McSkilly has noticed the link to documentation at the bottom of the page. When we click on the URL, it redirects to the endpoints API. Now we have some URLs, we can try an SSRF scan against them. So let's try accessing through API. Okay, so we've got a URL. So to request unauthorized resource, we can see that one of the endpoints, the one with the URL equals IP of client name of file, takes URL as a parameter. If an infected agent URL is provided to it, it will fetch all files from the infected agent. But what if we change the URL parameter to a different IP and try to access any other file? So instead of doing something useful, the exploitation example they're giving you is that if we change the URL on the to any other file on the host, we could still fetch it. So they're doing fetching a file var www html index.php. That will fetch the content of the index.php file. So let's try it. Let's actually do some of these examples. So let's take that one. So we get the content of that file. I'm guessing we could also do like there we go. So we can get things like that. Right. So the file scheme, when used in the URL, typically references a local file on the computer or file system. For example, the URL file path to any file is often used to access a file located on the local file system. Usually an attacker can access sensitive files like etc password, that's one of the examples I'd used, and then you can also use connection strings, so config PHP, connection PHP, and then those would typically have like passwords stored in them if they're not set up properly to retrieve it from a password store. So then that will take control of the C2 panel. So I'm guessing we actually need to get the credentials by accessing the files containing which will probably be in, if I go back, so we've got this. So instead of index.php, let's do config.php. Good, so there we go. So we've got username, password. Put them in text file. And then before we go anywhere, let's try the other one. So connection PHP. No, that doesn't exist. So it's just those two. So we go back to the login. Let's use McGreedy's login. Sign in. Don't need to save it. So we're in. So we've got in. So we've now taken some control of the C2. We can get the C2 panel's credentials by accessing the files and the password, and then we can log into the C2 panel. To prevent SSRF exploitation, the following mitigations are suggested. If we employ strict input validation and sanitization, the application can access. Applying network segmentation to restrict requests to authorized resources. Follow the principle of least privilege, granting the minimum permissions required for the system operation. So, like, one thing you could do, for instance, would be like to disallow file. Just stop letting people type that in, and then only allowing actual URLs to go through. And then whitelist those URLs so they can only go to specific ones. But yeah, so now we've got access, try and answer some of these questions. So is SSRF the process in which the attacker tricks the server into loading only external resources? No, because it could do internal. What is the C2 version? So 1.1. It's down the bottom corner. Down here. You can see it. Where am I pointing? There. So 1.1. What was the username? It was McGreedy. What was the flag for accessing the C2? Should be this one. And then what was the flag value after stopping the data exfiltration from the McSkiddy computer? So we've got some kind of like host control somewhere. Let's have a look. 2 new computers added. There's McSkiddy. So if we look, we can get files, keylog, screenshot. We just remove it. And then we get agent remove. There we go. So there's the next flag. Cool. And then if we enjoyed this task, we can check out the SSRF room, which will go into more specific detail. And this is sub only. So you have to subscribe if you want to do that. I've already done it. So we won't be going over that again. I've probably got it saved somewhere. If not, I'll repeat it at some point. But yeah, if you enjoyed that, you can check that room out. And that is it for day 22. So this wasn't too bad, actually, compared to some of the early ones. I want to play around with the C2 now. What other things can we do? Get file. Keylog. Okay, it doesn't do anything. That's annoying. Alright, well, if we just remove everyone's access, yeah, get wrecked. Take that C2, let's delete everything. I like how I can just infect all the states by clicking on them. As if they didn't make those clickable. I have got to commend them on how like low effort some of these examples are. It's quite funny. Like you couldn't have just like made some additional functions to like get them to like actually show you data.